afternoon and welcome to IFPRI. I'm Rajul Pandya-Loj, Chief of Staff and Head of the 2020 Vision Initiative here at IFPRI. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this special IFPRI 2020 Roundtable event on investing in strengthening the resilience of smallholder farmers. This is a lead-in event for our 2020 consultation on building resilience for food and nutrition security. This consultation is a 2-year process, the highlight of which will be an international conference that will be held in Addis Ababa on May 15 to 17, 2014. Save the date in your calendar. The theme of this consultation, resilience, is timely, as poor countries and poor people are being hit hard by an increasing number of economic, environmental, social, and political shocks. We in the development community understand that there is a need to help individuals, communities, and countries prepare for, cope with, and recover from these shocks. There is far less understanding, however, about resilience within the context of food and nutrition security. So this consultation, this 2-year consultation we are planning, will address the questions of how we can foster resilient agricultural systems and livelihoods, what the role of food and nutrition security is in building resilience, how we can measure resilience, and so forth. We have flyers available on your chairs and outside at the registration, and we hope that you will visit the conference website to learn more about what we are planning with this consultation. IFPRI's new strategy, which was also released earlier this year, identifies resilience as one of the 6 strategic research areas, and we expect that this consultation will also feed into the larger IFPRI research agenda. This morning, in fact today, our 2020 and Strategic Advisory Council met here at IFPRI to provide advice and guidance on the conference theme and topics, among other issues. We had an absolutely fascinating discussion, a very rich, very lively discussion, and that has given us a lot of food for thought and will help frame the discourse we hold in Addis Ababa. Members of the advisory committee are here in the audience, and I hope that you will have a chance to interact with them during the reception that we have following the event today. So I'd like to thank them for their insights and for their advice, and for being part of this journey here together with us. At this time, I would like to turn over to John Heller, who is Senior Director at Synergos. And John has done a wonderful job moderating events for us before, and we're delighted that he's joining with us again today. John will introduce our speakers, and he will set the stage for what will no doubt be a lively discussion. Thank you very much, and welcome all of you again to IFPRI.
Thank you, Rajul. Let me join my friends at IFPRI in welcoming all of you today to our conversation about investing in strengthening the resilience of smallholder farmers. We have with us today a superb set of panelists. Each of them brings really deep knowledge about the topic and really different perspectives, which I hope will help us have a really enriching conversation for the next hour and a half. We have with us Tom Arnold, Special Representative for Hunger at Concern Worldwide, Kathy Spahn, President and CEO of Helen Keller International, Martin Pineiro, Director of the Grupo CEO, Chair of the Committee on Agriculture of the Argentine Council on International Relations, and Special Advisor to the FAO Director General, and Shenggen Fan, Director General here at IFPRI. As Rajul mentioned, they've all come from a prior meeting, and we had a little pre-meeting just a minute ago. They are fired up. The issues are really out on the table. There's a lot to be said. There's a lot that they want to hear about, and we're going to have a great conversation. And there's a lot of wisdom in this room that we're going to hear from as well, too. So the plan for the next little while is we're going to hear a little bit from our panelists to just get the conversation going. Then we're going to turn it over to our audience for comments and questions. But before I hand it over to our panelists to begin, I'd just like to say a few words around the conversation that we'd most like to have. First, I'm really going to encourage everyone to stay focused on the topic, investing and strengthening the resilience of smallholder farmers, of course, within the context of improving food and nutrition security. As Rajul mentioned, this is all going to be great input for the conference that's going to happen in Addis next year, which will look at resilience and resiliency in a little bit broader frame, but today we're really going to focus on smallholders. Second, I'd like to set a particular tone. So our intention is to have a really open and engaging and honest dialogue today in a relaxed climate where we can really talk about the real issues. So I'm inviting everyone to come in the spirit of learning and the spirit of sharing. Everybody has something to offer and everyone has something to learn. We're not necessarily trying to reach consensus. Some of the issues that we'll be dealing with are complex and still under investigation. So I really just hope everyone's coming with an open mind. Third, we'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. The remit that I've given the speakers, and which I'll also give all of you in the audience, is to keep your comments really focused, really short, really brief. Get right down to the main point that you'd like to share. We don't have a lot of time, so we'd really like to get as many ideas out on the table as possible. And lastly, if there's issues that are beyond the scope of what we'll talk about today that could be useful in the conference that will happen next year, just flag it for us. Let us know so we can make note of it. So there's a place where good ideas can go that may not relate to our topic this afternoon. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to our panelists and ask Tom Arnold, how do you think we should be investing in strengthening the resilience of smallholder farmers?
Well, can I answer by maybe giving a few examples of the sort of work that Concern has been doing with precisely that objective? Concern, for those of you who don't know us, Concern Worldwide, we've been operating since 1968, both as an emergency response organisation and working with the very poorest people. And obviously in many of those situations, coming out of an emergency, out of a crisis, the question is, how do people, get back to where they were, or hopefully get back beyond where they were? So that's our background. And I want to give you talk about three examples that we've been working on over the past number of years, all of which are dealt with in this document, the 2013 Global Hunger Index. So I'll briefly describe what's in this document. You can read more about it later. The examples are from Niger, Kenya and Chad. Now, I've actually seen two of these examples in Niger and Kenya. I haven't seen the one in Chad. But if I could talk about Niger. Niger suffered probably a relatively short-lived food crisis in 2005. It was July, September 2005. And it was dealt with, if you like, a lot of big international effort to deal with it, and then it faded from the scene, as so often happens. Concern was there in Niger, and after about 6 months after that crisis, we commissioned a study, an anthropological study from Durham University. And it came up with some really interesting findings, that it wasn't so much the shortage of food as such that happened that had caused the trouble and some deaths, and it was really more some deep-seated cultural factors in that society, like very poor weaning rates and so on. So as we were there and as we were monitoring what was happening in subsequent years, I suppose we were preparing for when a next crisis would come along. And that crisis began to emerge in late 2009, when there was a significant crop failure. And in 2010, I was there in 2010, and I saw we had a three-pronged approach to deal with that. The first was, having done nutritional monitoring, there was direct nutritional intervention for the most severely malnourished children. The second prong of the intervention was cash transfers to people. And that was actually done through mobile phones. The first time it had been done in West Africa. And the third prong was preparing the people for their next harvest season by making sure they had seeds on time. Now that was, it seemed to me at the time, it was a well thought out intervention. It had a number of the correct elements. But this is the conclusion that we arrived at some time afterwards. The realization that both cash transfer and nutrition programs that focused on seasonal hunger were not enough to create resilience to periodic hunger crises, and that longer-term development interventions focused on building absorptive and adaptive coping strategies. So that obviously, I suppose, a relatively understandable conclusion that, we dealt with the immediate problem, but there was remaining still a longer-term problem. We now move to Kenya, and Concern was working in an area called Moyale in northern Kenya, and in 2010, and had done a number of significant investments there over a period of time. 2011, the drought that affected East Africa, particularly Kenya and Somalia, there was an evaluation done in probably sometime in September 2011, and it found that it showed that Concern's program showed that in Moyale, where we'd been working for the previous 18 months, its level of severe acute malnutrition rate fell by 50% in early 2011, when those in neighbouring areas rose more than threefold. So there was a very definite, the interventions that had been built up, the community capital that had been built up in 2010 and into 2011, had a direct impact in terms of the malnutrition rates in 2011. And what was done in order to do that? It was the strengthening of resilience at the community level, more diversified farming, improved irrigation systems, diversification of livestock, a pastoralist area, the strengthening of government capacity to respond to nutritional crisis, working with the local Ministry of Health. Again, crucially, early scale-up of high-impact nutrition interventions when the warnings were triggered. And then finally, coordination between Concern, the local Kenyan government services, and the World Food Programme and World Vision. Now, again, we didn't have the data sufficiently well established to absolutely demonstrate that this was, there was cause and effect here, even though it was pretty obvious that Moyale doing much better than the other areas. So with that in mind, and bearing in mind the fact that we wanted to really try to get to better grips with this issue of how a community develops a resilience capacity, we framed a new program, a new research program, Action Research, in Chad, where we're partnering with the Feinstein International Centre at Tufts University to evaluate what we call the Community Resilience to Acute Malnutrition program. And that's a 3-year program which is underway. It involves water, nutrition, disaster risk reduction, livelihoods, and inequality interventions. And the essential elements of that program are improving agricultural production, again, things like homestead gardening, which I'm sure Kathy will talk about, improving access to health, improving access to safe water, working with community groups at all levels, promoting social and behaviour change. So they are, if you like, the core elements of this program aimed at improving resilience. And the second part of the program involves a comprehensive community-based early warning system that identifies thresholds for key indicators that signal the lead for an emergency response. So that's the sort of balance we're working on. And in this latter program, because we're going to be working with Tufts, going to provide the sort of, evidence-based conclusions about this set of interventions which hopefully will demonstrate, hopefully will provide to that community a level of resilience. So I'll stop there.
Really interesting examples, a lot to come back to.
And Tom is right. Of course, he had inside information. I am going to talk about Helen Keller International's Homestead Food Production Program, which is something we've been working on for about 25 years. And basically, it's a food-based approach, but it has an essential combination with nutrition education and behavior change communication, and more recently, a livelihoods component. So I just want to review quickly 6 lessons we've learned over those 25 years, and then 5 things we really could be doing better. One of the most important lessons is get the design right. Understand the program impact pathways that you want to influence, and be sure that you're addressing not only the immediate causes of the poor nutrition, but also looking at the underlying determinants, which was something Tom just referenced. So obviously food insecurity, poverty, the low status of women, and linkages or the lack of linkages to health care. So design is key. Number 2, there are no cookie-cutter approaches. You've got to understand the local context and adapt your program design to it. You have to understand not only local farming practices, but local culture as well. And then you have to involve the community from the get-go, from the beginning of planning on through all of implementation. Local partners are going to be essential for this work to be sustainable. The role of gender is critically important as well, and you have to be sure that your programs are enhancing rather than undermining women. So, for example, if you've got a home gardening program, there can't be so much work expected of the woman to plant and tend the garden that takes her away from the care and feeding of her children. But you've got to be aware of other gender-based biases as well. Just as we can't assume women are not interested in marketing or commerce, we can't assume that the men shouldn't be involved in training in nutrition or infant and young child feeding. So that's something to always be really vigilant about, which leads to the 5th point, which is having an eye to equity. When we originally started out, we chose who the demonstration farmer was by looking at who had more land, who had some farming experience, and who had greater literacy and numeracy. So what were we doing? We were playing to the privileged household of the poorer households in the community. So we were actually inadvertently increasing inequity rather than helping. So we've developed several strategies around that now, whether it's having group ownership of a model farm, whether it's watching all of the farmers first and then choosing the model farm by the initiative shown. Lots of different ways you can let the group itself select who the village model farm is. And the sixth point, and perhaps the most important, is that these homestead gardens don't work without nutrition education. You have to have effective behavior change communication strategies to get the families to adopt optimal nutrition practices. The programs aren't nearly as successful without that. That said, as I said, we can and we've got to do a lot better. Chief area to look at is to strengthen the aspects of the program that are related to hygiene and sanitation, since that leads you right to poor hygiene and sanitation to gastric illness, so that the nutrients the families may be ingesting go right out. There's no nutritional benefit. Given the relationship that's very tight between nutrition and disease, where poor nutrition leads to greater disease and disease depletes your nutritional status, you've got to design programs that have better linkages with the health sector. Also have to have much stronger monitoring and evaluation, so you've got a feedback process along the way, so you can keep refining as you go. And programs that are agricultural programs have to have nutrition indicators, otherwise we'll never know what they're doing. Projects also, and this is probably a message for donors, need to go on for 5 years or longer so that there's sufficient time to adapt and refine the program and get it to a status where you can begin to develop an evidence base and then look at taking it to scale. And then one last point that perhaps isn't thought of a lot is we all tend, I think, as humans to tend towards silos. So we approach this programming looking at the really, really vulnerable. Then we look at people who are vulnerable but viable. Then we look at people who are vulnerable but they're adapting. And then we look at people who are thriving. What we don't look at is how you get them from one level to the next to the next. We look at what is the solution within the way that we've labeled them. So we really have to spend time looking at what are the sociocultural behaviors that are the barriers to that mobility through those different systems. What's getting in the way? What are the household decisions that are determinants of whether they can lift themselves up? Determinants such as what crops are planted, what the children in the household are fed, even what farming techniques are being used, and very important, how is the surplus produce when it's sold, how is that income used in the household? So we've got to understand the determinants of all of those decisions and what's driving them, because that's going to have a major impact on their nutrition resilience. And I just close by saying we're using the word resilience so easily here. We spent half of the morning arguing about what the definition of resilience was, and we did not arrive at a standard definition or conclusion.
Good, and we'd love to hear perspectives on that from the audience in a few minutes as well. But again, really helpful comments to get us going. Thank you. Martin.
Thank you. First of all, a disclaimer in the sense that I've been working in relation to, in the theme of resilience, basically in my work in FAO in defining the strategic framework. But by no way I will speak as FAO, so whatever I say, it's me. First of all, and following a little bit in what just Kathy said, I think that one of the basic problems we face is that the concept of resilience has not been defined very precisely. That the first thing we need to know is getting an agreement of what it is resilience after all. One of the expressions of that is the definitions. You probably have seen that there are at least 5, 6, 7 definitions that people are using for resilience. FAO has one definition, which is, in my mind, rather long, descriptive, and clear. IFPRI has another one, which I think is quite good, but I still think it could be improved. So in a way, to work all together in one concept, we have to be in agreement on what the concept is. I think that one of the reasons that has happened is that resilience has been, work on resilience, especially in response to crisis, is something that has been done very intensively, and enormous resources has been used in the last, let's say, 20 years. And still, in some regions like Latin America, it's a relatively unknown concept. People don't think very much, governments don't think very much in terms of crisis, shocks, resilience, whatever. So in my mind, I think that jointly we need the organizations, we need to put a lot of effort in thinking a conceptual framework and defining, let me say, something like the theory of resilience, so that we can focus better and we can relate the work on resilience with the work in development. And I think that is probably the main challenge that we have in front of us. So the third bullet is that one of the main difficulties, and is expressed in the definitions that are being used, is this tension between what is resilience and what is crisis response and what is development. And in a way, resilience is usually taken as a short-term thing, development as a long-term thing. Not surprisingly, one of the definitions of TERFs between FAO and the World Food Programme, which are probably the two major global actors in resilience and response to risks and disasters, is that World Food Programme works in the short run and FAO works in the long run. That's probably not a very wise division of labor, because things are obviously the long term is just the addition of a number of short terms. So I think that we need to think about that, and I have one suggestion that probably is not very new, or maybe is not new, but which is that we should probably recognize resilience as a special dimension of development. When we think in development now, we normally think in three dimensions: growth, poverty, sustainability. So I say maybe we could add a fourth dimension, which is resilience. So then we would integrate resilience into development thinking. It would be probably easier to develop a conceptual framework, and we would not have this permanent division and contradiction or tension between what things belong to resilience, what things belong to development. I have a feeling that if we did that, then the type of work that, for example, FAO does would change, would be different. And of course, my message, being in IFPRI, is that probably IFPRI has a major role of doing this work in relationship with World Food Programme and FAO, but providing what IFPRI is really good in thinking and providing conceptual elements from hard evidence, while FAO and especially World Food Programme are mainly the implementers of the thing. Thank you.
Very helpful. Again, lots to come back to with your thinking around, filling in the conceptual framework to make sure that our actions are guided by the right high-level thinking.
Well, let me welcome you to IFPRI to participate in this very important event. The previous speakers, Tom, Kathy, are really role models of IFPRI partners. So we have been working with them. So they have been on the ground. We learn from them. We also share our experience with them. One of the challenges for research institutions like IFPRI is sometimes we do not try to learn from the NGO civil societies or the practitioners. But in your case, we are very sincere and we learn a lot. So some of the joint work has really opened our eyes. And the collaboration with FAO has also changed for the last 3 or 4 years since the new FAO DG came to the position. So we have been working together on several important topics: the gender, the nutrition, and many data issues. So now, why we should focus on smallholders? We know that there are lots of poor and hungry people who are not smallholders, who are not farmers, not urban consumers or nannies people. But don't forget that the majority of the poor and hungry people in the world are smallholders. And they are very vulnerable to different shocks. So the natural shocks, the market shocks, and conflicts. We have seen increased correlation between conflicts and food insecurity in many parts of the world. And they're also very vulnerable to health shocks. Health. If some household members are sick in the family, then the whole household will be shocked because of that individual shock. So there are many, many shocks to smallholders. What can we do about it? And how, I think I very much agree with Martin that we still do not have a clear concept or definition of the resilience. But my understanding is a resilience should be the ability of a person who can prevent, cope with, and recover from the shock and grow, even grow. So it's ability for that person to prevent, to be able to predict, prevent. When these shocks come, then the smallholder will be able to cope with it, recover from the shock, and even grow out of the poverty and hunger. Well, obviously, the concept needs to be further developed. The measurement is critical. If we don't know how to measure it, then we do not have clear instruments. We don't have clear instruments for tackling the resilience issue. Sometimes we are very confused between the measurement of shocks and the measurement of resilience. So how do you measure shocks? How do you measure resilience? So resilience is ability. How do you measure the people's ability against the shocks, not the shocks itself? Now, why smallholders? How can we help smallholders to build the resilience for their growth, for their prosperity? One is technology. I still think that technology plays a huge role there. What sort of varieties? I was at the International Rice Research Institute just about 2 weeks ago. I have seen some very exciting new rice varieties that can help to enhance the nutrition and build the resistance or ability against droughts, against floods, against diseases through technologies. And on top of that, to help to mitigate the climate change, to reduce the carbon emission. So technology plays a huge role there. But we have to make sure that smallholders have access to those technologies. The second is investment in irrigation. This is an area we have not paid enough attention to. If you look at the typologies of sort of vulnerability across different world, it is the rainfed area where it is the most vulnerable to weather shocks. In irrigated areas, with good irrigation, with good drainage, usually the vulnerability is much lower. So we have not paid enough attention to that. Then obviously, markets. Many smallholders do not have access to markets, do not have access to credit financing issues. The risk coping strategies proposed by the World Bank and IFC still yet to be implemented. And I also wanted to use one of the successful examples. The IFPRI has been working with Ethiopian government. It's called Productive Social Safety Net. Ethiopia used to depend on food aid. So the poor people continued to rely on food aid provided by WFP, by many other donors. But about 5 or 6 years ago, the Ethiopian government launched a new initiative called Productive Social Safety Net. In short run, the social safety net will provide food to women, children, to the people who need support. And in longer run, that social safety net should be able to help them to build the assets, small irrigation, animals, access to agriculture services. And IFPRI did an evaluation and found that combination of the food aid together with assets building through this program have much higher returns, not only in terms of smallholders' income, but more importantly, in terms of the nutrition impact. You might remember in 2011, when the Horn of Africa experienced drought, 13 to 16 million people in Somalia, in Kenya, suffered from drought or suffered from malnutrition, hunger. Ethiopia is in the same zone, Horn of Africa, but the impact in Ethiopia is much smaller because of the social safety net program, or productive social safety net program. So with that, I think smallholders have very important role to play. Different institutions, investment policies need to make sure that the smallholders can increase their resilience against all these shocks.
So I'd like to come back to Tom and Kathy just for a moment from your ground-up experience. And what really struck me about both of your comments was around the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with, and the need to bring in health, market, various levels of government, community, working at multiple levels at the same time. And so I wonder if you could help us understand what's the sort of state of play around this collaborative space, what's missing in terms of collaboration between government, business, civil society, different levels and different actors, and what's the opportunities for better collaboration?
Well, I mean, I do think, and Kathy made the same point, that a really crucial issue is an understanding of the socio-cultural environment you're dealing with. So, I mean, that only comes either through, a reasonable time spent with knowing that society or getting insights into it. There are many countries where the institutional capacity between, say, local ministries of agriculture and health is actually quite weak. And so, again, whatever you're doing, you always... Well-known Irish politician John Hume used to say in regard to Northern Ireland, you start from where you are, even if you'd like to be starting from somewhere else. But you start from where you are in terms of local institutional capacity. And, and that's going to take time to build. Obviously getting buy-in from the local authorities in terms of a regional or a district leadership is very important. And then after that, I think you have to see how the capacity of the local administration can combine. And this is where NGOs can play a really important role. Mm-hmm. They can fill in capacity gaps and with resources or with particular skills. So, starting off with a very realistic assessment of what you're doing, and then it is a key. The other key thing is, I think, as from what we've both said, is that if a community is particularly vulnerable, you need to have in place, if you like, tripwires to know when the situation is going from just ordinary levels of vulnerability to much more dangerous levels of vulnerability, and then after that have a capacity to respond relatively early.
Right.
And I'd just add to that given the complexity, if you're bringing in water people, hygiene people, early child development people, whoever you need irrigation to move forward, that you've got to spend a lot of energy up front to make sure everybody's using the same playbook. Because the last thing you want is everyone to leave the gate going in different directions. And one way to kind of test that is to make sure everybody has shared indicators, that you all share a definition of what success is going to look like in that program. So it's really important to front load the program on the design side and the community involvement side, because otherwise it'll find its own tripwire.
That's right. And I wonder if I could follow up with both of you that around the sort of policy framework, what sort of policies should governments be looking at around increasing resilience? You mentioned a really good example in Ethiopia, but how might that vary from country to country or region to region, or maybe examples from Latin America around how countries should be thinking about this?
Yeah, two comments. First, if IFPRI has done sort of a separation saying economic shocks and crises, climatic-led or politically led. I think that is a very interesting division and helpful division, because the responses and what you need to do are quite different in the case of economic shocks or climatic shocks. And there I think it is also very important to separate let's say the dimensions, the micro dimension against the macro dimensions. Because adaptation, adapting to potential threats and shocks, is something that individuals and communities can do a lot. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about getting prepared for and responding to shocks, that's a macro dimension. That's governments. In a way, you're trying to socialize the individual costs of having shocks or disasters. And that's basically, I think that the initial steps, or the work we need to do is to a great extent capacity building. As you know, the international community did 50 years ago with research, and then in the last 10 years with social protection programs. Now it's the time for resilience and response to shocks. And that implies a different institutional structure, different frameworks, policy frameworks, that in many, many countries don't exist.
Well, I very much agree with Martin that there is no policy framework at the national level to deal with the resilience. The Ministry of let's say, the social welfares usually focus on short-term relief, to give away money, right, give away cash or food, without thinking of long-term development. Ministry of Agriculture very much focus on food production, very much production side. Ministry of Economic Development focus on long-term overall growth through sort of macro instruments. One way to do is to make sure that the Ministry of Social Welfares work together with the Ministry of Agriculture to combine some of the instruments together to make sure that the social protection programs can also help the poor to improve their ability or capability, build their resilience against shocks for long-term growth. National level. Global level, WFP has been working on food aid for some time. WFP began to think differently. I think Willie was one of the pioneers in looking at the food aid for development. But if you look at the actual operation, well, I think still very far away from that. But in the meantime, FAO just took this initiative recently, and the IFAD recently is interested to look at the smallholders and the resilience. So we can all work together to make sure that the national level, global level, have a policy framework. Short-term relief for long-term growth. Now, I very much like the community level work. We can learn a lot from the private sector, from NGOs, from civil societies. One of the areas we have not done well is to look at the informal institutions. Over the thousands of years, community level informal institutions and network have helped each other, whether through family, relatives, or through community practices. So that's some of the areas we have not paid much attention. So it's not just the economists. We need to bring sociologists, anthropologists into this debate.
I'd like to build on that and ask other panelists to share what do they think are really some of the missing gaps here. We know some things about this whole concept of resilience, but what's the agenda for research? What else do we need to know that would really inform actions going into the future?
I think there's a huge agenda. I mean, just the very basic thing of we know the science in the sense of we know what promotes good nutrition, but we still don't know enough about the delivery science, about how to really deliver those programs and bring them to scale. So that's a huge area. I think we need a lot of local formative research on what BCC strategies really work. We've got a lot of theories, we've got some experience in the field, but we need more of that. And I think we have to look at program impact pathways for women's empowerment and see just what role that can play. How powerful is it? How do we measure that? And I could go on, but I'm sure my co-panelists will add to that list.
I suppose the basic operation of the principle of prevention in many things is relevant. You know, a stitch in time saves nine. It'll be a lot cheaper to intervene earlier than actually treat a situation that has got much worse. And I mean, one positive thing that has really happened, which I think people should be aware of in the last number of years, is, you know, in the field of nutrition, the whole commitment by now 42 countries to sign up to the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. That's a real investment in the future of individuals and in the future of societies. And I think that's the sort of thing which perhaps in other areas we could also look to. But certainly the Sun Initiative, I think, is something that offers a real ray of hope for countries at the international level and should very much be built on.
One comment at the micro level. I think that we need a lot of research that defines what are the things that provide resilience, or let's say better adaptation to potential shocks, because that comes probably with a cost, in the sense that agriculture is moving into more commercialized, specialized, technified type of production systems that are probably more vulnerable given globalization and given the increment of climatic change events. But we really don't know very much. And using the example of Shenggen, of irrigation, in many cases, for example, irrigation cannot be justified on the basis of its contribution to growth or to poverty. So it's not done. Now, if you include the resilience dimension, then maybe it would be justified. I'm using the example to say that there are many other things that under the present logic are investments that under the present logic cannot be justified, but if resilience was incorporated as a dimension of development, they would be justified. And that means a lot of research in each production system in each region.
Well, I can say the knowledge gaps are huge, huge. At the global level, we still don't know how to work together to make sure that the country's effort to build their own resilience do not sacrifice the global level resilience. We learned from the 2007-2008 food crisis. Certain countries used export bans to make sure that their domestic price was stable. China and India, if we look at their price, they were very stable. But they exported or transit all this shock to the global level. So make the global level much more vulnerable. Do we have a mechanism to work together? So new WTO round discussion on the new leadership can do something about it. So global level, we still have enough things to work on. Trade issues, market information systems, and beyond. The national level, in addition to trade, what is the role of national strategic reserves? Too much, obviously, is a waste. Too little, they may not play any role. And research, can research system be redesigned to tackle some of the issues we have discussed, not simply just to increase the yield? Reduce the variability, enhance the nutrition, to address the climate change shocks in the future. And individual level, how individuals can build their resilience against the shocks. Insurance, through be part of the network, or through diversify their economic activities. So not just agricultural, diversification of their economic activities can really reduce the vulnerability when the shocks come.
I just wanted to add that the information regarding early warning, it's something that is very underdeveloped, and it is a major thing. If you look backwards, we had a financial crisis that almost ended the world, and nobody knew that it was coming. Then we had the food crisis, and nobody knew that it was coming, although now with the hindsight, you know that you could have guessed that it was coming. So that implies some additional research and some additional mechanisms that provide early warning, not to talk about climate, that